The summer Elias Corder buried his wife. The prairie did not mourn with him. The grass stood tall and indifferent under a pale August sky, and the cattle moved slowly through the heat as though nothing had changed, as though the world had not hollowed itself out sometime between Tuesday evening and Wednesday dawn. Clara had been sick for 3 months, which was long enough to prepare a man and not nearly long enough to actually do so. The fever had come first, then the coughing, then the long silences that stretched between them like open country, too wide to cross, too familiar to leave. He buried her beneath the cottonwood at the north edge of the property because that was where she had liked to sit in the evenings, watching the light go out of the sky in slow amber ribbons. He did not say much over the grave. He had never been a man of many words, and whatever words he had, the grief had taken them. That winter was the longest of his life. He kept the ranch going through sheer stubbornness, feeding cattle in the dark before sunrise, mending fence lines in temperatures that cracked the skin of his knuckles, cooking meals he did not taste, and sleeping in a bed that felt too large for one man. His neighbor, old Hector Baines, came by twice a week with cornbread and conversation. Elias accepted the cornbread. By spring he had begun to pray, not the practiced kind, not the Sunday morning recitation he had grown up with, but the other kind, the kind a man does alone in a barn at night, with his forehead pressed against the cold neck of his horse, asking something formless and enormous to help him understand what he was supposed to do now. He did not ask for much. He was not a man who had ever asked for much. He only asked, quietly and without expectation, that he not spend the rest of his life this alone. The letter came through the church in Millhaven, which was 12 miles east, and the closest thing to a community Elias belonged to. Reverend Dutton had started keeping a board of correspondence for frontier families, ranchers, homesteaders, widowers, anyone whose circumstances made ordinary courtship an impossibility. Elias had agreed to have his name added the previous autumn, mostly to satisfy Hector, and had largely forgotten about it. The Reverend handed him the envelope after service on a Sunday in late March. The handwriting on the outside was careful and even, the letters pressed firmly into the paper as though the writer had wanted to be sure they would not smear. He read it that night by lantern light at the kitchen table. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 34 years old, originally from Tennessee, currently living in a boarding house in the town of Cider Creek, 2 days east by stage. She had been widowed 2 years prior. She had 2 daughters, Nora, who was 11, and me, who was 7. She wrote that she was a capable woman, accustomed to hard work and harder seasons. She wrote that she was not looking for rescue. She was looking, she said, for solid ground. That last phrase stayed with him. He read it 3 times. He wrote back the following week. He described the ranch plainly: 400 acres, decent water, a house that needed some attention but was structurally sound. He described himself the same way. He said he had 1 milk cow named Patience, which his wife had named, and that he intended to keep the name because it seemed appropriate. He said he did not have a gift for flattery and hoped plain honesty would serve in its place. She wrote back within 2 weeks. She said plain honesty was exactly what she was hoping for. They exchanged 4 more letters over the following 6 weeks. Each one was careful, measured, the way conversations are between people who understand that words carry weight. She did not tell him much about her late husband. He did not press. He told her about Clara only once, briefly, and she acknowledged it with a single sentence that said more than a paragraph would have. "I know what it is to carry someone's absence, asterisk," she wrote. "I will not ask you to put it down." He folded that letter and kept it in his coat pocket for reasons he did not examine. She arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of May. Elias had driven the wagon into Millhaven to meet the stage, arriving early because he was a punctual man by nature and more anxious than he cared to admit. He stood at the edge of the stage yard with his hat in his hands and watched the coach pull in through a rising curtain of dust. 3 passengers descended: an older man in a dark coat, a young clerk with ink-stained fingers, and then Ruth Calloway, who stepped down with one hand gripping the coach door and the other already reaching back for her elder daughter. She was not what he had imagined, which he realized immediately was his failure of imagination. She was dark-haired and brown-eyed, and carried herself with a composure that suggested she had learned it the hard way. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that came from squinting into difficult light. She wore a grey travelling dress that had been mended at the hem, and she did not look embarrassed by this. Behind her came Nora, who was tall for 11 and watched everything with large, cautious eyes. And then me, the younger one, who descended the coach steps with great ceremony and immediately looked around the yard as though she was assessing the whole of the frontier and finding it acceptable. Ruth found him before he could speak. She walked to him directly, looked him in the face, and said, "Mr. Corder." Not a question. She had sized him up from the letter and recognized him from it, apparently. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "good to meet you in person." Likewise, she glanced at the wagon, that a Morgan horse. Quarter horse, mostly, some Morgan, maybe. She nodded as though this confirmed something, good working stock. He had not expected to feel at ease so quickly. He was not sure he was at ease, exactly, but the particular tightness he had been carrying in his chest since before dawn had loosened somewhat. He helped load the trunk. Nora watched him carefully through the whole process. Me picked up a rock from the stage yard, examined it, and put it in her coat pocket. The drive back to the ranch took most of the morning. Ruth sat beside him on the bench and asked practical questions about water sources, about the nearest town, about the winter severity, about whether the root cellar was reliable. He answered each one. The girls sat in the wagon bed. Me asked the name of every bird they passed. Nora said nothing, but watched the land go by with an expression he recognized as someone memorizing an escape route, just in case. He understood that. He did not take it personally. The first 2 weeks were careful. Ruth was efficient in the kitchen in a way that made Elias feel simultaneously grateful and self-conscious about the state of the pantry. She reorganized it on her second day without comment, and he noticed and said nothing, which seemed to be the right choice. She was up before him most mornings, which he had not expected. He had not expected a great many things about her. She did not treat the house as though it were hers, but she did not treat it as though it weren't, either. She found a middle space, respectful of what the room still held of Clara's presence, practical about what needed doing, and she inhabited it without apology. He found this easier to live with than he had imagined. The girls were different from each other in every way. Mia attached herself to the ranch with immediate and total commitment. By the end of the first week, she had named 4 of the calves, attempted to teach the barn cat to sit, and developed a firm conviction that the best spot on the whole property was the top rail of the south fence at sunset. She told Elias this seriously, on the 4th evening, as though she was sharing important geographic information. "You might be right about that," he said. She seemed satisfied. Nora took longer. She helped with chores without being asked, which he appreciated, but she kept a careful distance from him, not hostile, just watchful. He did not push. He had learned from years of working with green horses that trust was not a thing you could ask for. You could only make yourself trustworthy and wait. Ruth noticed how he was with the girls. He did not know she noticed until one evening when she said, quietly, while he was cleaning his boots at the back step, "You're patient with them." "They don't need pressure," he said. "They need time." She was quiet for a moment. Their father wasn't a patient man. He did not know what to say to that, so he said only, "I'm sorry." She nodded once and went back inside, and neither of them spoke of it again that night. But something had shifted, some small door had opened, the kind you don't walk through immediately, but now you know is there. The trouble came in the 2nd week of June. It had been building for days in the form of sky, a particular greenish cast to the light in the afternoons, clouds stacking and reorganizing in the south, air that went from hot and flat to charged and electric between 1 hour and the next. Elias watched it with the practiced eye of a man who had lived on this land long enough to read its moods. The storm hit on a Wednesday night. It began as rain and became something else within the hour, a wall of wind that took the rain sideways and sent it against the house like gravel, a darkness so complete that lantern light only illuminated the inside of itself. Elias got the livestock secured before it hit, barely. He came back inside soaked through to the skin, his coat heavy as iron, to find Ruth at the kitchen table with both girls and every lantern in the house burning. Me was frightened, but working hard not to show it. She had pulled the barn cat into her lap and was holding it with both arms. Nora sat with her back very straight and her hands folded in front of her, which was, he had come to learn, how she looked when she was scared. "It'll pass," he said. "How long?" Ruth asked. "Couple hours, maybe more." She nodded. She rose and put water on to heat. Making tea in the middle of a violent storm was so practical that it almost made him smile. The roof held, though at one point something struck it hard enough that all four of them looked up. A branch, he thought. The window in the back bedroom leaked along the sill, and Ruth had towels down before he could say anything. They sat in the kitchen while the storm pressed against the house from all sides, and Me fell asleep somewhere in the middle of it with her head against her mother's arm, and Nora, very gradually, let her shoulders come down from around her ears. Elias made himself useful in the way he knew how, checking seals on windows, adding wood to the stove, keeping the lanterns trimmed. At some point Nora said, unexpectedly, "Is the horse okay?" "Checked on her before the worst hit," he said. "She's in the far stall, dry." "Does she get scared?" Nora asked. "Sometimes, but she knows the barn. Familiar places help." The girl considered this. "We didn't have familiar places for a long time," she said, "after Papa died." He looked at her. She was not looking for pity. He could tell that clearly. She was simply saying a true thing. "You've got one now," he said, "if you want it." She looked at him then, a long, clear look, the kind that a watchful child gives when they are deciding something important. Then she looked away, back at the window, where the rain still ran in sheets. "Okay," she said quietly. It was a small word. He felt it in his chest like the sound of a bell. The storm passed before midnight, leaving behind a sky so scrubbed clean it looked as though it had been wrung out and hung to dry. The land was muddy and rearranged, fence posts leaning, branches down, the creek already running higher than its banks. But the house was intact, and the barn was standing, and the cattle were accounted for by morning. They spent the next 2 days cleaning up. Elias worked the fence lines and cleared the larger debris. Ruth worked the house and garden, salvaging what the storm had overturned in the kitchen plot. Nora helped him without being asked on the second afternoon, handing tools, holding posts level while he drove them, and worked alongside him without much conversation, which was, he had come to understand, her natural mode. Me helped Ruth in the garden and provided continuous narration of everything she observed, which included 3 worms, a confused beetle, and her theory that the storm had rearranged the clouds permanently. "Clouds don't work that way," Nora called from across the fence line. "How do you know?" Me called back. "Because I know things," Nora said. "That is not an answer." Elias drove a post and said nothing, but something in him had gone warm. It was in the quiet of a late June evening that Ruth told him. The girls were asleep. The night was mild, the air still carrying some of the mineral smell of recent rain, and they were sitting on the porch as they had taken to doing, not by design, but because the evenings had pulled them there, separately, and they had simply stopped pretending this was not a thing they did together. "There's something I should have told you before I came," she said. He waited. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the dark land. "We didn't leave Tennessee because of the grief. I mean, that was part of it. But there was a man, Daniel's brother. After Daniel died, he thought," she paused, chose her words carefully, "he thought he had a claim on the property, on us. He's the kind of man who doesn't let go of things he thinks belong to him." Elias was very still. "He doesn't know where we are," she said. "I was careful, but I thought you deserved to know, in case," she looked at him then, "in case it becomes your problem too." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light from inside the window lit one side of her face and left the other in shadow, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had underestimated her entirely, not her competence, which had been obvious from the start, but her courage. The particular kind of courage it takes to be honest about a thing that might send someone away. It became my problem the day I wrote you back, he said. She was quiet. I'm not a man who takes on a family and then steps aside when it gets complicated, he said. That's not how I'm built. She looked away again, back toward the land. When she spoke, her voice was careful and even. Daniel wasn't a bad man, he just wasn't a strong one. There's a difference. I know, he said. I'm not comparing. I know that too. The quiet that came after was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes between people when something real has been said and doesn't require anything more. Eventually she said, I didn't come here expecting much, just solid ground. The ground here is solid, he said, and it's yours as long as you want it. She nodded once slowly. Not a woman who gave things away easily, not tears, not declarations, not easy gratitude. But her hand, resting on the arm of the porch chair, moved an inch toward his side and stayed there. He did not move toward it, he simply let it be there, which was enough, more than enough. By the time August came back around, the year Elias had dreaded most had become something else. He had not stopped grieving Clara, he did not think he ever fully would, and he had come to understand that Ruth did not ask him to. She had set a small vase of wildflowers under the cottonwood one afternoon without saying a word about it, and he had not asked her to explain because none was needed. Me had decided that the milk cow, Patience, was her particular responsibility, and Patience seemed to have accepted this without complaint. Nora had started riding with Elias on the morning fence checks, not every day, but often enough that it had become a kind of understanding between them, unhurried and unspoken, the way the best things are. Ruth had put glass in the back bedroom window to stop the winter leak, before he could get to it, using a piece she had found in the supply shed, and cut herself with a steadiness that still surprised him even when it shouldn't have. On a Sunday morning in mid-August, he drove them all to the church in Millhaven. They sat together in the fourth pew, which was where he had always sat. Me spent the sermon drawing horses in the margins of the hymnal with a pencil she had smuggled in her boot. Nora sang the hymns in a clear, careful voice he had not known she possessed. Ruth sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and when the old women of the congregation glanced over with their complicated expressions, she did not flinch. After the service, Hector Baines shook Elia's hand for a long time and didn't say much, which from Hector meant everything. Driving home through the late morning light, with me asleep in the wagon bed and Nora watching the land with a little less suspicion than she had in May, Elias thought about the prayer he had said in the barn on a dark night almost a year ago. He had not asked for much. He had not expected much. The cottonwood at the north fence was already going gold at the edges. He let himself be grateful, quietly, the way he did most things, without ceremony, without needing it witnessed. Just a man on a wagon bench in the August sun, moving toward home, with the particular and enormous luck of the living.